There's the magic sound.
We'll just let people in.
And so, and I'll be, I'll be introducing you as folks get their sound on, and along the way, we'll go ahead and continue to let folks in, and then I'll just keep monitoring if there's any weird and wackiness going on the unusual, possibility that I need you to pause. I'll ask you to, but haven't had it happen yet. But again, yeah, that's life. Life is an adventure.
It absolutely is.
Well, for those of you who are coming on board, welcome this afternoon. We're going to continue to admit folks as they come on in through the next few minutes. My name is Seth Stander, and I have the privilege of serving as the community aging specialist for that part of the Hope and Healing Center and Institute known as CARES, which stands for Caregiving, Aging, Resilience, Ethics, and Spirituality. We are here today under the auspices of the Hope and Healing Center and Institute's clinical services. I am serving in the stead of, but could never replace, our Chief Clinical Officer, Dr. Maddie Steers. But I have the privilege of serving in her stead today to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Robert Gearing from the University of Houston's Graduate College of Social Work. As you may be aware, today's topic is entitled Religion and Suicide, Mental Health Assessment and Treatment Practice Implications. And we're going to want to give Dr. Gearing, he mentioned perhaps just prior to when I hit the record button, that this is a subject not only near and dear to his heart, of course, his professional passions as well, but there are levels of detail that could completely fill this hour and much more. So I'm going to give a brief biographical sketch by way of introduction and have Dr. Gearing take the wheel and lead us today. As I mentioned, Dr. Gearing is based at the University of Houston's Graduate College of Social Work, and he directs the Center for Mental Health Research and Innovation in Treatment, Engagement, and Service. Through his research, Dr. Gearing seeks to inform and improve adolescent and adult engagement and adherence to empirically supported psychosocial and medication treatment, and to further the development of evidence-based interventions. For over a quarter century, Dr. Gearing has worked clinically with youth and continues to observe and address the uneven efforts, to say the least, to manage the functional, emotional, and physical costs of serious mental health conditions. His research has primarily concentrated on treatment engagement and adherence in relation to mental health and suicide treatment, service delivery, and service utilization. He's conducted a series of studies examining and operationalizing the multidimensional components of adherence, identifying the barriers, promoters, stigma, and temporal patterns of adherence, and investigating the development, adaptation, and promotion of treatment adherence strategies and interventions. Dr. Gearing has conducted multiple studies focused on suicide, which, among other outcomes, has resulted in a textbook used by educators, teachers, medical and mental health providers on assessment and treatment. It is a privilege to have you speaking to our group here that is assembled for Dr. Gearing. You can start whenever you're ready.
Excellent. Thanks for the invite. I want to meet this guy. Sounds like an interesting fellow. I'm Robin. It is lovely to meet everyone today. If you have any questions as we go out throughout our talk in the next hour or so, please put them in the chat, and Seth is going to moderate that as I try to pay attention to what I'm going to be saying. But Any and all questions are certainly welcome and encouraged throughout this time. So with that, I'm going to step us into sharing the screen and going forward at that point. Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen. We're good on that?
We look good, sir.
All right. Okay, that's the topic. We're talking about religion and suicide today, and then how that may relate to some of your practices going forward, and what is the state of science. And that's really what I'm going to focus on, what the state of science is, more than what the perceptions are. So in overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about religion and suicide rates, religious and spiritual risk factors and protective factors, and how we can incorporate some of this when appropriate into assessment and treatment. To give a little bit of background information, the suicide rate in the United States has increased pretty dramatically in the last 25 years. In other countries, that suicide rate has not been nearly as strong. Of an increase, we've seen some decreases overall. Here, we generally measure most health issues per 100,000. It's easy to compare. So if we can say how many lymphoma cancers in a certain area or a demographic or a state, it's easy to compare regardless of the population. And we do that with everything. Similarly with suicides. So when we look at how many per 100,000, this is the number 13.42 in 2016 and so on. There was a slight drop during COVID, part of COVID, but it has increased since then. So the suicide rate in the US is about 50,000 per year, which is a small city every year. And the numbers have not gotten better. So if you look, there's been a 37% increase since 2000. There was this little decline between 2018 and 2020, but since then, there's been a 10% increase. So you can see that we're just continuing in a path that's different than many countries. So we're a little about 14.2 per 100,000. In the US, about every 22 seconds, someone will attempt suicide, and this rate is often seen as a little bit conservative. Probably. There is about one suicide every 11 minutes. So through this presentation, 6 people will die. It's about 132 per year, per day. And about 54% of Americans are affected by suicide. To make this even more concerning, about 1 in 4 Americans do not have someone to confide in. That's a pretty staggering number. Now we've seen that number grow as well. Which leads us to starting to think about, and here I'm really going to be focusing on the intersectionality of religion and suicide. Happy to talk about other questions related to either suicide as makes sense. As way of introduction, suicide has been conceptualized as a spectrum. Sometimes it's seen as a very something noble, important freedom, as well as something that's unacceptable, morally wrong, an indication of mental illness, a crime, an offense against God. All of you, every human, has a perspective on this. It will be important to know what your perspective is and how that may or may not be the same as your clinical approach. Alois Durkheim was really the godfather of suicidality. He was a French sociologist, and he noted during his seminal work almost 130 years ago now that there is a spiritual commitment and religious connection that may contribute to emotional well-being and providing a source of meaning and order. So research has established a relationship between high levels of religiosity and decreased suicide risk that dates back now 60 plus years. But not everything is as it seems. And I think when we're looking at some of the facts behind it, we got to consider the nuances. So you can all see an apple core here. Do you all see the little child's profile on the right of it? So here. So initially when we see something, or it may not be what's really there, which is what I'm trying to highlight this. So across history, religions have incorporated elements of life and death and have exerted an influence on their followers' understanding about perceptions and behaviors related to suicide. I'm going to spend some time talking about some of the dominant religions. I have studied, and others have studied and looked at many other religions. I'm only highlighting the more common ones. So I'm going to focus on Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, and Judaism. All have been historically found to be associated with decrease in suicide risk. Religious attendance, and when we look at religiosity, really understanding what that means. I'm using that a bit more than spirituality, but in some research and some studies, it's used interchangeably. And it's hard to really measure someone's faith. So we often use the term religiosity as in how many times do you attend service or mass, or how many times do you go to the temple or the mosque or the church? Do you say grace or prayers before meals or at standard times in the day? Do you do other aspects of it? And each study has slightly different methods in how it's trying to capture. Just because someone has high spirituality or high religiosity does not make them highly religious. It's just those are the indicators we're looking at. And we have found that individuals residing in nations with greater sense of religiosity tend to have lower rates. There's caveats to all of these as we'll go through. But it remains unclear whether it's a negative association between religion and suicide is due to some sort of beliefs around social cohesion and the moral imperativeness of the belief structure. So, for example, most faiths will say at some degree or level, if you suicide, you can't go to the good place, whatever you want to call them. Some will deny and have denied religious burials, even religious rituals over individuals. And that negative proclamation that you can't suicide or ought not to suicide is what we see as the negative association. But there's also a positive association with religion and faith where people are around a social network of supportive individuals frequently. There's often religious leaders who also provide a level of support and care. There are rituals and coping strategies, prayer and attending service and such that all are also protective. So we have this balance between there's a negative effect and a positive effect. And really trying to piece some of that out has been a bit more challenging. So the protective effects of religion are not really due to one specific denomination. So we research, and I and others looked at this. It's not that we're going to say this faith is better or strong. We're just going to indicate that where they are, and all faiths seem to have some advantages. And it's all this strong commitment that most religious faiths hold to the basic life-preserving values, beliefs, and practices, which are often important in how suicide is viewed and considered amongst followers. So here's some studies we've looked at. We're looking at the rates of suicide across these four. We've looked at other ones, but again, I'm going to highlight these ones: risk and protective factors, some guidelines. So just to start off in general, and we looked across faiths, males have higher suicide rates are associated with lower levels of religious beliefs amongst those that have. For females, religiosity is not as strongly associated with suicidality. So I'm going to bring in when and where that might look like. Attendance to services by gender. So males' attendance is associated with lower rates of suicide. Females attending greater than one or greater religious services per week have a 5 times lower suicide rate compared to those who've never attended a religious service. There's protective factors. So for females, the suicide risk might not predominantly be affected by attendance to the religious services, but a wider range of religious dimensions, beliefs, religious experience, prayers. The experience, a stronger protective factor is the effect of religion on men. Generally, when the studies have looked at it, even if they have comparing psychiatric disorders present or not present in males and females. Now, for high-risk pregnant women, religion can also serve as a protective factor, which includes that social support, giving purpose to life, and coping strategies. And we know that pregnancy is a very high risk factor for suicide. Quite younger age, and we're looking just at basic demographics. Religious communities often act as a bridge to mental health services that are very helpful for younger people when religious communities can do that. Religious participation has been associated with lower rates of suicide ideation, generally younger people, and participation in religious activities reduces behaviors which would be considered attempts and or completions of suicide. For older, religion is a protective factor, exerts more influence on older populations than younger, which it seems to have a greater effect. And religious attendance for really people 59 or older was associated with less ideation. Typically, religion has religiosity has greater effect on the behaviors than it does on the ideation. Religious practices, where is this? In older adults, often add things like elements of meaning and comfort that are more beneficial in the older population group. Okay, I just want to touch upon ethnicity and suicide a little bit. There's like a lot of studies on this, but in looking at some of the two dominant communities in the U.S., U.S. and Latino populations, U.S.-born benefit from religious communities regardless of the denomination. However, research has shown that foreign-born appear to benefit more from Catholic adherence. Now, partly that is how other countries, primary, Hispanic countries, faith, and incoming those that have been in the U.S. for a generation 2, 3 have exposure to sometimes more different faiths. So it's hard to know exactly what's driving that data point. Among Black communities, religious beliefs among Blacks may serve as a buffer against increased effect of psychiatric disorders on suicidal thoughts. We also see it's an improvement, a buffer against Blacks on suicide, full stop. The protective effect of religious beliefs on suicide was mainly or is more present in African-American males with psychiatric disorders when we looked at psychiatric disorders rather than females or Caribbean Black adults. And there's only been a few studies that have started to look at the different groups within the Black communities or different groups in the Latino communities. For example, Puerto Rican identified Latinos in the U.S. have one of the highest suicide rates, where Cuban American identified Americans have one of the lowest suicide rates amongst the various Latino subgroups. I just like this picture. And it's a transition. So I'm going to move from general demographics kind of into some of the core mental health categories. So among individuals who are depressed, those who reported negative religion had higher suicide ideation. So negative religion is the opposite, the not believing or the believing that God or religion is terrible. Individuals compared to those who have a stronger sense or stronger reported sense of religiosity, that's where we're seeing that difference. Depressed inpatients report lower moral objections to suicide, had significantly more attempts when they did not have any religious affiliations compared to those that did. And depressed individuals endorsing positive religiosity tended to report lower suicidal thoughts. There is the negative effect of religious spirituality. So anger toward or questioning of God, feelings of being punished or abandoned by God. So has been associated with increased ideation amongst individuals who are depressed. And certainly depressed individuals, that negative schema and thinking is more common. So be mindful of that reverse part. Amongst religion and bipolar, there's less studies in this area. So highly religious affiliation was actually associated with an increase in suicide behavior. And we don't know if it's directly related to, let's say, a manic state. Some of the methodology questions again. And moral or religious objections to suicide mediated the effects of affiliation on behavior. And we look at suicide, religion, and schizophrenia. Researchers tended to find that people with schizophrenia and are religious have increased coping mechanisms, generally a greater sense of hope, purpose, and meaning for life, better social integration. There has been some studies say a lessening of symptomology, reduced substance use co-occurring conditions, and more likely to maintain themselves in treatment. Okay. In looking in general, religiously and religiosity associated with it is associated with a reduced risk of suicidality, but the evidence is somewhat inconsistent. Although very strong, it's inconsistent. And part of that is, studies often look at attempts as a behavior, sometimes completions, and less at ideation. And that can be problematic because sometimes attempts aren't effectively defined, and ideation is sometimes not as maybe concisely measured. Also, how we measure religiosity, is it the level of participation, the type of engagements one does in their faith or religion, the degree of affiliation? All of these things can have a distinct effect on it. The intensity of religious commitment and beliefs has been shown also to have reduced suicidal behaviors. And moral and religious objections to suicide have a unique and very strong association with suicide behavior. I have known many clients over my practice, when I've asked them if there's suicide, they say, yes, very much. And I'll talk, you thought of planning it, but I would never do it because of my faith. So that is where that kind of the moral thing can come in. Suicide rates in, I said, more religious countries, and certainly the US is seen as a more religious Christian country than other developed Christian countries. Intensity, okay, we should talk about that. And again, the findings, I don't want to say are particular to a religious denomination, although I'm now going to talk about soon religious denominations. We do know there's certain mechanisms, or mechanisms are, what are some of the underlying factors that affect this phenomena? So we call them often mechanisms of change. Those are the ingredients that have a strong effect. And most religions have a strong sanction against suicide. Sometimes that's because life is defined as being owned by God, or and others, if you do it, you can't go into the good. Like all of those are sanctioned kind of thoughts. And religion is discourages violence, and suicide is a type of violence. The religion tends to promote peace and unity and life-affirming values, which also counter suicide. Religions provide opportunity for extended social support, both with other congregants, members, and clergy, which is very, very helpful for individuals who are suicidal. And religiosity is associated with also lower levels of aggression and hostility. So on average, people who are more religious have lower levels of aggression and hostility, which then also have lower levels of effective suicide. There are some challenges. The protective nature of suicide may vary on a number of dimensions. They are not the same on ideation, behavior, and completion. Typically, they have less effect on ideation. Ideations are thoughts, what we do with the thoughts and the behavior they seem to have, religion seems to have more of an effect. Sometimes religious attendance, and this is often true for females more than males, against suicide ideation doesn't become significant once you remove or control for social support that religion may provide. So, and large portions of clergy tend to report feeling ill-equipped to deal with parishioners experiencing suicidality. I have talked with religious leaders in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hindu. I've been called frequently when there's deaths and suicide. I generally rather talk with the religious leaders and give them the information that they may want or need, but it's not a common core training. I think there's some better training that is occurring, but by and large, most feel ill-prepared. I just like this picture, and again, I'm going to transition. So what I wanted to spend 10 or so minutes on is just looking at some of the different dominant faiths. Again, it's not saying one is better than another. If you have a faith, great, and if you don't, good for you. So in alphabetical order, with C being the first one, suicide in Christianity. The word suicide does not appear anywhere in the New or the Old Testament. The act of suicide is reported 7 times. Interestingly enough, 6 of them somewhat positive. Suicide was really conceptualized in the faith of Christianity by St. Augustine in the 5th century, that seen it and equated it with the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Killing then equating to anyone or self. After all, suicide is self-kill, like homicide is killing another. Later, Thomas Aquinas described suicide as even further than just breaking that commandment. It is a sin against yourself, your neighbor, and God, which is, on the religious spectrum, a bit more harsher. Many Christians believe that life is a gift, and God and only God can decide when life should start or end. Therefore, suicide would be going against the wish of God. Now, there are many different faiths and sects within Christianity, and I'm not going to say it's true of all of them, but it's certainly pretty core to most. In the Catholic faith, individual that is mentally competent has to be mentally competent for an act which he or she partakes in to be deemed as a sin. So in the Catechism, this is described, and it's been described in other Catholic documents and tenets, which means if the moment of suicide, the person was not competent due to physical or mental strain, therefore it was not a sin, and therefore they can be buried with full religious rites. And frequently people in Christianity and religious leaders are looking at more like this. So in the past, you could not be buried on holy ground. You could not go to heaven. And if you were Catholic, you could only ever go to, what is that, midway? Purgatory. You couldn't go further. And if you really wanted to find out who suicided more than 89 years ago, when you walked around graveyards, specifically in Europe, but in some in North America, you would see who was buried on the edge of the graveyard. Because if you were a more wealthy family, you could donate money to the church to have your person buried in holy ground. However, because they died of suicide, their feet would be buried under the fence in unholy ground, anchoring them to earth. They don't do that anymore. And people are like, yes, you can still, many religious leaders are now saying at the time of suicide, you can still, may not have been fully competent. And if that's the case, then you get the rights of going to whatever good place you've earned. Generally, the highest rates of suicide are among more Protestant faiths. The lowest rates are among more Catholic faiths. We do find that the more traditional a faith is, so Baptists have much lower rates than other Protestants, for example. Catholics had the highest level of religious participation involved in church activities, and they therefore might be benefiting from that expanded social support network. not necessarily from how the Bible or tenets of Christianity are interpreted. Religious rates tend to decrease for Christians approaching Christmas or the holiday time, but then return to normal levels shortly after New Year's. When they did this one study with more than 2,000 participants, those that attended church 24 or more times per year had lower suicide ideation compared to those who did not attend church, and participation in Christianity is positively associated with lower levels of both ideation and behaviors. So suicide in Hinduism, the Hindu scripts are less resolute on the issue of suicide as being an unacceptable act. In the works, I'm going to mispronounce them, often indicate that abandoning one's life force, which is suicide, is discouraged. Hindu philosophers and philosophies looking at reincarnation and karma often recognize that life does not end at one's death, rather death leads to rebirth. This reincarnation tenet has led some scholars to suggest, while discouraged, there may be more tolerance for suicide in Hinduism. Some scholars in Hinduism have argued that, some have argued that's not the case. In looking at suicide in Judaism, there are generally strict sanctions against murder, and suicide is seen again as self-murder, as it is in many faiths. The doctrine condemns suicide. Individuals simply do not have that right. The Jewish law does not consider the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, as applicable to suicide, where in the Christian faith it traditionally is. Opposition to suicide is derived more from the preservation of life above all else. In the Jewish law, an individual who acts on impulse, and this comes from some of their work on death by suicide. So an individual who acts on impulse or who is under severe mental strain, physical pain, when they take their own life by suicide as being an anas. I probably mispronounced that word, so bear with me. Meaning a person under compulsion, and hence not responsible for their actions. Therefore, all burial and mourning rites can be observed for those who have died by suicide because of mental illness or physical strain. And so we're seeing this, I don't want to say it's a shift so much as a clearer interpretation and what that might mean. Suicide rates have historically been found to be lower in Jewish faith. The rates are lower in Israel than amongst the Jewish adherents in the US. Higher rates for suicide are amongst males and females, which is not uncommon. The suicide rate for males and females is about 4 to 1, 3.8, 4 to 1. Prevalence rates seem to increase for suicide, which again is quite common. That's more of the norm. But there are differences across subpopulations, just like in Christianity and Hinduism, and Judaism has many different sects. So suicide in Islam. Suicide in the Holy Quran, with the surah are like chapters. If you're kind of looking at the Torah or the Bible, the verses 29 through 30 explicitly state, do not kill or destroy yourself. There's no middle ground. It's the one religious scriptures that clearly delineate this. And the Quran refers to suicide as self-murder and strongly prohibits, even wishing for death is specifically rejected. Now, many countries still have a crime against suicidality. And I know when I went and gave some talks in Pakistan on just suicide and treatment of suicide, you could be imprisoned and get and be fined. And that still exists in many countries, over 30. So while limited, research has found lower rates of suicide among within the Islamic faith. Research remains limited, not only due to overall reported data, but also within the religious subgroups that are quite distinct within Islam, not only like the larger Sunni and Shia, but all the other subgroups and small sects. I shouldn't say smaller, lesser known sects. Intrinsic religiosity has been demonstrated to be a protective role in Islam against attempts. Endorsing strong beliefs, even when the individuals experience a high number of stressful life events or even psychiatric symptoms, have been shown to be helpful. We do find, or the research has found, that suicide attempts rise amongst those in Islam on religious days. So Eid, certain parts of Ramadan. But this might be more associated with the fasting. Like during Ramadan, it is much easier to go through Ramadan in the winter month and it moves with the than in the summer months when you're having 12, 14 hours of daylight. So there's some question on that. The suicide rates are increasing amongst young females in Islam at a higher rate than other specific subpopulations. Research has identified the rates are expected to be higher. Suicide rates are higher in areas where there's greater social regulation over the lives of women and those holding stronger traditional tribal cultured views, where the intersection of tribal culture with faith. Areas in which females had lower rates of education, labor force participation, and urbanization also had higher rates in Islam. Surviving members often find themselves, and this is true of many faiths, but there's been studies on this in Islam, ostracized, stigmatized, people being reluctant to bury. So some have suggested that suicide may not actually be as low as we think it is, but reflect a very clear underreporting due to social stigma. Okay, I'm going to turn away from faiths a little bit and talk about how the intersection of culture and religion has interesting effects. And what we tend to know is culture beats religion, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon because religion is very, very important. So here's a couple of examples. So in Indonesia, in this Gunung Kidul area, it's like a county, has the highest suicide rate. So it's a population of 2 million. Indonesia is very large. And this area of Indonesia has like astronomically higher rates of suicide than other areas of Indonesia. And the reason is, it took a long time to figure this out, and there is a cultural belief that if an individual sees a shooting star, there will be soon or in the near future a suicide by somebody they know in the direction of that star. So the star going into the east or the west, somebody that area will die by suicide soon. And you can think, well, that's an odd belief. Every culture has some unique belief structures. How does that matter when the religion is so clearly against it? Well, suicide within this belief is connected to fate and a preordained tenet. So if that's preordained by fate, it doesn't matter what we do as clinicians, what agencies do, even what the religion has to say, because suicide prevention is perceived as impossible, because how can you prevent fate? So very interesting kind of phenomenon in this area. Here's a study that's looked at. I've talked to one of the authors, really fascinating. There is another one and this is around a dream. And I again talked to you about the stories and culture really have an interesting impact on all of them, but I'm just highlighting two. So we know in Islam, suicide is very strongly opposed. So the hadith, I'm pronouncing it wrong, is, I want to get this straight, is stories of what the Prophet Muhammad said during his life that were recorded by others. There are generally two types of stories in the hadith that are more acceptable. Those that those that are strongly accepted to be the Prophet Muhammad's words, and those that have been said that we could be hearsay, but we really don't know, or they don't know. I will say this is not my faith, so I'm getting a lot of this from when I work with communities of this faith. So that's where the Hadith is from. So it's not seen as strongly as the Quran, and it has some effect. But in the Hadith, there's this story. A man moves from the Bedouin area to Medina. Now, Bedouins in Islam and in Arabic countries are seen as farmers, people of the earth that are wholesome, good people, and the reflections often of the best of us in society, tied to nature. And moving to Medina, which is seen as a city, and cities are dirty and full of pollution and sin and all those kind of things. So this man moves from a very nice area to a very unnice area and gets quite sick. So the idea is he's gone from this pure environment to a city. So bloodletting is very common in the 5th, 6th century. We did it all through Europe. We did it everywhere else. People thought if you cut yourself and bloodlet, that would let the bad stuff go. That's really not how it works, but it was common enough thought. So he cut his knuckles, both hands, quite significantly, and eventually he dies from this bloodletting. So later, his son has a dream that his father's in heaven. His father states that Allah has forgiven him and allowed him into paradise. His son noticed that his hands were behind his back during this dream, and then he asked his father, "Show me your hands." And his father said, his fingers were not allowed into paradise. Upon waking up, the son who went and told his dream to the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet prays to Allah to allow the fingers to be restored and into paradise. And some scholars have argued, Islamic scholars, that this might be an indication that suicide that is maybe non-intentional, or at a moment where it wasn't seen as a person had full control over themselves, does not consider it is exempt, and they can be buried and have all the rights. And increasingly, we have seen that with many with many people of all different faiths. Okay, this goes into Buddhism. I'm conscientious of time. I'm not trying to rush through one faith over the next. I left out many other ones, but it's there for you to go and look at. So there are some challenges when we consider religion and suicide. Religious service attendance is not always a protective factor for ideation, but seems to be stronger for attempts. Protective factor of religious attendance, more for females than for male, may be mitigated once we control for social support. And we know many clergy feel less equipped. Here is some results of some various studies. So 25 to 30% of clergy across various faiths reported a suicide in their congregation in the last year. And only a third reported receiving any adequate training on suicide prevention. I would say that these numbers are grossly low. There's probably much higher than that, like much lower than that. I would say that it's not 25 to 30%. By what we know of statistics and everything else, it's probably closer to 60. But this is self-report. 85% of clergy reported that their role is to provide education on suicide and mental health to their congregants. 32%, they have no or low ability to do so. So it's hard to be able to do this, even when you think you should be doing this, if you don't have the skill set or training to do so. 70% of clergy stated concerns about the parishioners' mental health. They would ask about suicide. Again, we know from research, although 70% said they would, most don't. It is much lower than that. 10% of clergy subsequently referred help seekers to mental health providers on suicidal issues. So hopefully that number is going to be changing over time. There are no formal guidelines that include religious information on assessments. There's been some recommended guidelines. So here is recommended that mental health clinicians be very mindful to maintain an ethical boundary, and that incorporating religion would be relevant to a person who has a connection to that faith. If they don't, proselytizing is not encouraged or welcomed. I typically, when I talk with clients, will say, I'll ask them after when I've done my suicide assessment or near the end of it, do you engage in a faith? Do you have a religion or a faith? And if they say yes, I ask them more about it, and I'll talk to you how I do that. And if they say no, I move off it. I think preaching is a great profession. It is not mine. And that would often disrupt and destroy your therapeutic alliance if you're trying to proselytize. So well, that's not our task. We certainly want to be conscientious of various things like maintaining a person's inner approach, being mindful of our value system, and our sense of faith and religion is not anyone else's but our own, and not to be challenged to someone else. I remember supervising someone who had literally said, "You know, you go to hell if you try to end your life." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I go through a one-way mirror, go to just a moment here. You may have that belief structure, but that doesn't equate to anyone else having the same belief structure." And you want to be very open-minded and have a genuine interest, which means if you're able to be curious and open in looking at that, and try to avoid self-disclosures about your own belief structure. They are less relevant, and you're not trying to influence someone else's faith. Dr. Alonso and I do a lot of work in suicide together. Said certainly when you're assessing, ask about the importance of religion to the client. Ask about the importance of religion to their family and significant others. They might not have a faith, but their family might, or a partner might, or vice versa. Assess the importance of religion in their identity. Some people, that is very core to whom they are. For others, it is not. And assessing the attitudes towards conceptualizations of suicide in one's faith. My job isn't to clarify someone's faith in suicide. My job is to ask someone if they have a faith, how do they think their faith views this issue. And we might ask the historical role that religiosity has played during times of stress and difficulty in their past life. Everyone's gone through challenges, so how has difficulties in their past, have they used religion or faith in some ways or not? Assessment of the potential benefits of strengthening someone's religiosity and participation. So if someone does have a faith, I ask them, is this an area they may want to consider exercising? Or they used to have a strong faith and they haven't engaged as much lately. I might say, is this something you might want to reconnect around? Again, I'm not saying they ought to or they shouldn't do it. I'm merely presenting it as a viable option if that person has a faith that they're engaged to. And again, whatever that faith is, it doesn't matter if it's Hinduism, Christian, Islam, or, a more wider, understanding of it, like Mother Earth, or, I've talked to people, I have a general sense of spirituality in the world, but not as, okay. We know that there's positive effects regardless of how it's seen. And we want to sometimes assess their belief in an afterlife. That might have an influence. Assessment of how meaning of life works or the strength of their convictions. And we also want to assess for traditional folk leaders or figures or spiritually. I've often encouraged people who are very spiritual to engage with their religious leaders. Now, sometimes religious leaders can be very negative. And that's something you want to have a conversation about too. Like if you're sitting in a church or sitting in a church and you're told that, had these human thoughts and you're destined to a bad place, that really affects maybe God is punishing. So what that might mean or not mean to that individual. So in concluding on I'm sorry for rushing through a lot of this, the act of suicide is traditionally condemned across most religions, but what's changing is the understanding that people still will. Each major religion provides many effective coping strategies for many people: prayer, rituals, religious service, social networks, on and on it goes. Aspects of religion are potential risk factors for increased suicide among some followers. So many in the LGBTQ community have been ostracized and removed and kicked out of their church. And that is a terrible thing for an individual to go through and can cause greater suicidality. I have worked with different religious leaders and find that most humans are good and caring people. And the vast majority of religious leaders are good and caring people who are trying to do the best with those they work with. We all have heard of some who use their position to sexually exploit and abuse and cause harm to others, and that causes a massive suicide risk for many people. So although that is not in any way, it's a very small percentage, it has a very big effect on many. So to be thoughtful of that. We do need to have more research looking at the relationship between religiosity, gender, age, culture, ethnicity, and stigma. And we're beginning to look at, and the more nuanced we can, I think, the better it is. And clinicians need to be aware that religion does play an important role in the lives of so very many people. For a long time, we're taught not to talk about it. Assess it like any other area or domain in someone's life. If they're engaged and that's part of them, it becomes part of the conversations and assessment. And if they're not, it doesn't, and we move on. Again, I really want to say don't proselytize. Okay, with that, I thank you very much for your time and letting me talk about this issue. I know it can be quite controversial for many, but overall, having a faith seems to be a lot of benefits. I included here, of course, 988 is the suicide hotline. You can call anywhere across, it's like 911. You can call anywhere across the US and answer it, and they will, you should practice. I always say that when I'm teaching clinicians and working with them, call it, just say, I just want to see what my clients might go through. And it will say, and the answer, if you want English, this, Spanish, this, if you're LGBTQ youth, you press this number. If you're a vet, you play, like they'll walk through it. If you want to get stickers or materials, I gave you where you can find some of that. This is me. And anytime, if you want to have any questions on any specific thing I've talked about or more information, I'm quite happy to talk with and share that information. The work we do in looking at health and mental health and suicide is really, really important. And I want to promote that in any way I can. So with that, I'm going to end my kind of formal talk, and I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Seth.
Well, I want to thank you very much for what I know you to go on in such important detail as far as the information that you have begun to share with us today. And I certainly thank you for the thoughtfulness that you've put into each aspect of your presentation and your willingness to make yourself available post today's webinar for any further questions that folks may have. I'm going to exercise privilege for just a moment and just go ahead and mention something that actually hit home during your presentation. I was a pulpit rabbi for 2 decades before I moved into the fields of chaplaincy and elder advocacy and nonprofit work, as I do here at the Hope and Healing Center and Institute. And I believe I was well prepared in my seminary training for a lot of things, but not for mental health crises. And so your point very much hits home. I do believe you are absolutely correct that the numbers that you indicated, your professional observation that they are undercounted, I wholeheartedly concur. And I believe that in many ways, clergy remain underprepared, if not wholly unprepared, to go ahead and to help manage through a mental health crisis in the lives of people in their communities. So we encourage the use of 988 for crisis, and for the purposes of less than crisis, something that requires perhaps more than the clergy person may be able to do personally. Remember that there are also warm lines available. And if necessary, depending on what is shared there, transfers to hotline services can certainly take place. The Hope and Healing Center does maintain a warm line, and I put in the chat through the thread for those of you who've been following along with us that ultimately, if you go to our website as one example, to hhci.org, you will go ahead and you will find a link you can click on that will give you the phone number for our Hope Line, which operates daily from 5 to 8 p.m. Central Time. But we also will encourage contacting 988 and other such first responder services if you feel like you are in danger of harming yourself or others. With that in mind, there was one question that came up a little bit earlier in the presentation I'd love to have you address, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. So my apologies to Sheila, who posted it in the chat. Her question is phrased as, so would being in a crisis situation be considered mentally incompetent? I'm going to reframe that just a little bit for the sake of today's conversation and say, if you appear to be experiencing a mental health crisis, are you automatically considered mentally incompetent? And I'd be curious as to your observations, both direct as well as the observations of clinicians with whom you have worked over the decades, when one does indicate that they are experiencing a mental health crisis. Does an assumption or an observation become a clinical decision that this person has lost a level of mental competency?
It's a good question. So I do not think in any way a mental illness, or in most ways, do mental illness affect one's competency. That's like saying, does diabetes or cancer affect one's competency? No, they're just health problems. Mental health problems are just health problems. Most people will experience, what the research goes, like the 20% if you're under the age of 12, 0 to 12, have mental disorder sometime in that year. 33% up to 18, and amongst adults, around 46%. At some point in their life will have a mental health, diagnosis. Does that mean it means it's normal? That's all. We are human. We go through human things. Almost all of them are straightly treatable and addressable in ways. And does going through, let's say, depression or anxiety being the most common of all disorders, depressions being the second most common? No, it's just common. And I often say to people, you appreciate your health most just after being sick. So I just had a bad case of COVID, despite taking all the medications. And I tell you, breathing is really wonderful right now, but I will forget that in a short period of time. And we tend to do that, and people, everybody has some degree of anxiety. They may not be at a clinical level, or some degree of depression. You wouldn't know happiness without knowing sadness. You wouldn't appreciate your health without being ill. Those are kind of common things. So I do not think that there's an equation to mental competency. However, there is for some more severe, significant episodic areas of some conditions. I think when people are looking at suicide, which again, ideation is really common. If we were to look at ideation, I would say over half of all humans will seriously consider suicide at some point, probably closer to 75%. It doesn't mean they'll act on them or do something. That's different. That puts them at a different risk factor. But it's not uncommon at all. The question in bringing those statements up is when faiths are looking at, it's kind of like your last decision might be affected by a lot of things, such as your mental health or your physical pain or other things that may not have been in your full sound mind. And it's a nice way to rationalize, whether correctly or not, that person is a good, caring, religious human who can't be faulted for that singular act. And I would often say, as I say to everyone, I hope I am never judged on my best act. And I really hope I am not judged on my worst act. I am all things, and we are all things. And I think looking at that competency issue allows religious leaders to say, hey, just a moment. These are good, caring people who have just gone through a lot of pain or a lot of challenges, and that might not reflect that they are some total of existence.
I love your answer, and what sprung to mind as I heard your answer was also the dispelling or the need to continue to dispel a myth that if you ask someone who has expressed to you suicidal ideation, whether or not they have a time frame, a plan, a method, you are not, in fact, enabling them to do so. It's actually quite the opposite. That the openness with which you discuss these subjects very often is a way to go ahead and to get to the deeper layers of pain that that person may be experiencing. And it is in my professional observation the case that many clergy find themselves not comfortable asking those questions. And when they are the people who are very often turned to first, it is something that we take very seriously here in terms of trying to enable those clergy to recognize the importance of bringing out these layers of questioning to get below the surface pain and hurt and help someone on a holistic level. And that using this language is hardly taboo. It is actually quite cathartic and can lead to a level of reinforcement that your faith tradition is not necessarily the reason why you are in pain, but rather potentially a source of comfort in a time of pain. Mm-hmm. And so I love when presentations like yours, Dr. Gearing, come out, because when these thoughts bubble up in my head, it's a sign that we're getting great resources out of a presentation. And I'm going to use that as a segue to thank everyone who has either watched this live or who will have the opportunity to view this recording at a later time. And we will get the link to that recording as well as the slide deck out in the near future to all registrants for this program. I love what you did today. And am deeply appreciative of the fact that not only did you give us great information, the fruits of your decades of labor, but also percolating questions of true meaning. And so thank you for your time and your expertise today.
Thanks so very much for giving me the opportunity to come and talk about these are some important issues that often don't get the light of day, and they need to.
Yes, indeed.
Open discussions make things a lot easier for most humans. So thanks very much. I appreciate that. If I can be of assistance, please feel free to reach out on any questions. With that, I'll wish everyone a great rest of your day.
And I hope everyone has a good rest of the day as well. A kind and gentle remainder of the week to all. Take care, everyone.